Alberta. Treaty 4, 6, 7, 8, and 10 nations are here, as well as the Métis. It's also a place where oil and gas have boomed, driving the economy for several decades. The role for First Nations and Métis over the years has varied.
The last 10, 15 years, First Nations, wait a minute, we want to be more involved. So we have a lot more band-owned companies, are a lot more involved in the oil and gas development.
The oil and gas has really made a big difference for our people, not only in terms of collecting the royalties, but also providing jobs for some of our members.
But the oil and gas industry is also leaving a toxic legacy behind.
Just a little bit up here, not even an eighth of a mile, I know that I personally have shot moose, and we've used it for sustenance, and you know, here we have this area, again, decimated.
Some compare it to Yellowknife's giant mine, but on a much bigger scale, across an entire province.
Their estimate is that there's $260 billion in cleanup, and they currently hold much less than $2 billion in security against that.
And that bill is far more money than the industry has contributed.
All of these liabilities being piled on into the Orphan Wells Association, and no money to pay for it.
That tab doesn't even include fixes to aging infrastructure like pipelines that have a potential for disaster. Could it become a public burden?
You better run, run, run.
Regardless of who pays the bill, billions of dollars of work needs to be done.
When the devil calls your name.
The Nakota and Blackfoot were well aware of oil in their territories, tipped off by the presence of something called oil seepage. It's a natural process where oil makes its way to the surface. Clayton Blood is the general manager of Kainai Resources Incorporated, which manages oil and gas operations for the Blood tribe.
We've been involved in the industry right from the outside. Some of the wells in our timber limits were drilled in 1943. And this is about the time the Alberta oil industry was really started.
Recognizing the possibility of oil reserves on reserved land, the Indian Minerals Unit was formed in the 1950s. They were the predecessor to Indian Oil and Gas Canada.
We are mandated to help First Nations develop their oil and gas resources on their reserve lands. And there are specifically reserves that are designated by the tribes for oil and gas administration. And the oil and gas wells are mainly in northeastern BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and touching a bit into southwestern Manitoba.
IOGC assists First Nations in the development of oil and gas leases.
Nothing can be done without Chief and Council's approval, consent. Once we get that, then we come to terms with the company, we agree to the terms, and then we put those in place through a lease, and then we administer the leases as production starts. And then as production's producing, we collect the royalties from the oil and gas products that are sold. We collect the royalties that go into capital accounts for First Nations in Ottawa. And then on the revenue side, we collect the rentals and some bonuses up front. Those go into the revenue accounts.
So, it sounds like pretty easy money for individual First Nations, right? Not really. First off, there really isn't individual accounts. Most money gets deposited into Canada's Consolidated Revenue Fund. It's like a big bank account for all the government's money, including taxes and other revenue. According to Section 2 of the Indian Act, Indian monies means all monies collected, received, or held by Her Majesty for the use and benefit of Indians and bands. Indian monies isn't what it sounds like, though. It's still the Queen's money. And the band can't withdraw money like a bank account, but it needs the minister to approve each individual expenditure. The process of withdrawing money is complex. It requires a 118-page manual and a 5-page template with many requirements. Reserved land is owned by the Crown, so it's not really Indigenous owned. Gary Peranto is the oil and gas coordinator for the Fishing Lake Métis settlement. his community has similar rules to reserves that make it difficult to access money.
As far as being competitive in our community, we have a number of barriers that we face, being at the end of the road, last stop shop, financial issues because of the way that we own our lands collectively and unable to go to financial institutions. Some of those barriers have not been fully assisted with, therefore not able to capitalize fully on the development of businesses and have those businesses grow.
Rules that affect business operations.
Depending on production, when times are great, everybody had a small company going. When times turn bad, of course, they're the first to go. We cannot operate on a economy of scale where we have large companies we are trying to compete with. The large companies in the nearby towns are able to provide a service on quantity, therefore providing a discount, whereas if we have a sole interpreter that may have one or two trucks, for instance, cannot compete with somebody that has 50 in their company.
The low oil price affects not just Fishing Lake and other Métis settlements, but First Nations in Alberta as well.
You can see that world oil prices are very low, and it's causing, certainly some impact as to the kind of revenues we get.
As of late last year, Alberta oil is trading at a deep discount.
We are essentially giving away our oil for free.
The Alberta government went so far as to announce a legislated production cut in early December that went into effect in January.
Beginning on January 1st, the province of Alberta will mandate an across-the-board reduction of 325,000 barrels per day in production, or roughly 8.7%.
Later that same December, the federal government announced that, mostly through loans, it would provide industry support to the tune of $1.6 billion. All this while seemingly ignoring the elephant, or rather, orphan, on the land. Mike D'Souza is an investigative journalist who's been examining these issues.
I've been looking at, since they did the review of the royalties, as well as the seeing after the price of oil collapsed globally in 2014, that's when we started to see a number of companies in serious financial difficulty, a number of companies going bankrupt or near bankruptcy.
There is a strong concern that the industry and the province are unprepared for the challenges ahead.
Clearly, the Alberta Energy Regulator has been studying this issue for some time. There are people within that regulator that believe it's a serious issue that adds up to a lot of money. If you're talking $260 million, someone has to pay for it, and if it's not the companies, it's certainly something that's going to land on the lap of taxpayers and affect the credit rating of the Alberta government or perhaps even the federal government.
If that isn't enough, Regan Boychuk asserts the industry is in decline. Boychuk is a researcher examining the energy industry and was involved in Alberta's last royalty review.
The fact of the matter is the industry isn't going to be around for 50 years. It's already unprofitable. It hasn't turned a profit in almost a decade. And so we need to face those facts. Otherwise, we're going to be left with this bill. If these companies do go broke, they disappear, the public, the taxpayers, are going to be left with this mess.
It isn't just the taxpayer. Many of these sites are in reserves, settlements, and traditional territories. The IOGC does not have any involvement with Métis settlements or traditional territory, but has a specific role on reserves.
We focus on the subsurface leases, so that's where we sell the oil and gas product, and we have a license issued by the province to produce those wells, and then we work with the companies that produce those wells. And then, of course, Chief and Council is involved along in the process. And then once the wells start to deplete, then we look at how we start to reclaim those sites.
Not only does the province license oil and gas leases on reserve, they fund the reclamation of orphan well and gas sites on reserve through the Orphan Well Fund.
The companies are part of the Orphan Well Association, and so we're part of that program. And the Orphan Well Fund takes care of the well sites off reserve and, of course, on reserve. And we have one of our staff members that sits on the Orphan Well recommending committee for the different sites to be approved for abandonment and reclamation.
And when the oil stops flowing, the wells and the accompanying infrastructure are left behind. A big mess with a big cost. We'll have that coming up.
I'm appalled that industry has treated us this way.
Billions of dollars of economic activity flow through the province of Alberta each year because of oil and gas. But 7 decades of industrial activity have left a mark on the land.
So the tank was taken out of here. You know, the flow lines just left here, just abandoned like that. Just sitting there on the top. The shack is still here. The skid shack is here. The skid is there. Wells left there, nothing's done with it, just complete mess.
The cost of cleaning up when the oil is gone will be enormous. But who pays?
Alberta's regulations are weaker than 2 jurisdictions, Texas and New Mexico.
Dealing with orphan wells could cost up to $250 billion.
You know, again, here we have a bunch of hydraulic fluid underneath right at the well here itself again.
Eventually, they all run dry. That's when the government expects the oil company to suspend operation. It doesn't always seem to happen.
You can notice that on that wellhead over there that all the lines are taken off on it and that the wellhead isn't turning. So it's all shut off. It's been the flow lines are disassembled from the well itself, but everything else is just sitting here left in, and nobody's doing anything to reclaim these wells or to remove this eyesore from our community.
For the owner of the well, the asset becomes a liability. It isn't making money, and it'll cost money to disassemble and take it out of service. Next step, reclamation. Getting the land on its way to its original condition. But what the industry calls reclamation falls short of what Fishing Lake expects.
So when we do reclamation, what are we really reclaiming and back to what level? We've tried for years to get a native grass and seed back into our community, and no industry partner has gone that way yet.
So right here you'll see that there's an area where CNRL did take their wells out of here, and they took the containment out as well, but that's where it ended. Again, you do part of the job and then you leave it so that you can still claim it as an asset. Here we are at, again, somewhere where we should have this completely taken care of and put to bed and reseeded so that we can have it going back to our traditional way of life.
After a steep drop in oil prices in 2014, many companies went bankrupt, and their abandoned and suspended wells became orphans. In theory, the company should have already contributed to the Orphan Fund by way of the Alberta Energy Regulator's Licensee Liability Rating Program.
The way the regulatory program works is it tries to balance what they call assets versus liabilities.
The program has its flaws.
But the problem with those assets is they're fictional. It's just a number multiplied by another number. It's not money in the bank. There's nothing actually to collect. And we learn that the hard way when a company does go broke, like Lexin or Sequoia or Redwater. There was no assets to collect. The public never got any of that money.
Redwater was a company that went bankrupt, and their liquidator fought Alberta's regulations in court over whether bankrupt assets should be used to fund well cleanup. The lower court said no, they don't. The case went to the Supreme Court of Canada, and as of January 2019, a decision was still not made.
This Redwater case is what we have when we don't have regulations. So yes, there are perhaps some regulations that could be better enforced, but there are things that we could change to collect more upfront from companies, or to set a stricter timeline that forces them to clean something up, which then they have to put on their books. They have to demonstrate that they have that money aside to be able to pay for it.
Not all suspended or abandoned wells are orphans, but that is what they become after a company goes bankrupt. It's difficult to be sure of the numbers. The Orphan Wells website lists nearly 10,000 orphan properties. Meanwhile, the Alberta Energy Regulator has a list with over 89,000 inactive well sites. The numbers on reserve don't seem as dramatic.
We're concerned about the potential liability out there of all these potential abandoned wells. And for us on reserve, we have about 24 abandoned wells that we're working with. We have 7 that have been reclaimed. I'm working with some chief and councils right now that want to abandon, and some don't.
Toronto showed APTN the drilling activity since 1990.
The production since 1990 has grown, and the footprint on our traditional lands, being Métis settlement and Crown lands adjacent to the settlement, has a larger impact and a larger footprint. So if we start looking at the same map a number of years later, the footprint is astronomical.
Around 2,000 wells in various stages of production or abandonment.
There have been several reclamations done to date that may or may not have been done properly.
They have roads everywhere that they haven't reclaimed. They have lease sites that they don't reclaim. The fences are in disarray. You know, animals jump over them. Like, you know, it's disappointing.
It's not just old wells that need to be cleaned up. Pipelines, storage tanks, tailing ponds, and so many other industry leftovers are adding to the challenge.
If you look at the oil sands, all of these tailings ponds, you know, which are a massive part of the the liabilities, you know, it comes to 130 billion just for this section of mining alone. So there's a number of First Nations that are around the oil sands that, because of these tailings ponds, it has affected their way of life, their right to hunt, to fish, and not only that, it is a clear threat to their drinking water.
This is a groundwater catch basin, and you know, we know that water is integral to life, and so we worry about what's happening to the different water bodies within the community as well.
The Trans-Canada Pipeline, a national pipeline regulated by the National Energy Board, is estimated at $2.5 billion to abandon.
It really makes me wonder who's supposed to hold them accountable. You know, I hear about the Orphan Well Fund and see how these oil companies turn around and they exploit our provincial governments and leave the mess all the time, and nobody takes care of anything here. And you know, for us, it's a complete way of living that's getting devastated here. Our people hunt and fish, and they really do sustain themselves off of these lands.
The concerns aren't just about industry leftovers, land, water, and traditional use. It's about the work.
When I look around me and I see these service rigs sitting here and I see all these tankers, it's, you know, I sit back and say, why is it that, you know, that we can't have this equipment out working somewhere other than just Fishing Lake?
And it's not just the work being done, but it's who's doing the work.
When we look at industry partners, we always look and stress that the employment and training opportunities for our communities are always there. One of the major ones we find that are missing from a lot of our employment strategies, we find that the training most often than not include trades. Most of our Training and training programs are at the field level. They're very close to the wells. Nothing has gone beyond into management. There is no senior management. There's no intermediate management. There are no managers.
At this point, it isn't really clear who will pay to clean up what's left behind. And it isn't certain if Indigenous people will participate in the decision-making and the actual work of reclaiming the land. We reached out to the Orphan Well Association, who declined an on-camera interview. APTN Investigates also contacted the Alberta Ministry of Energy and are still awaiting a reply. APTN Investigates has also not heard anything from Canadian Natural Resources Limited, but we will post a follow-up on aptnnews.ca if we do. Clearly, the Indigenous oil patch isn't just about protest. Sometimes, the participants also need to take a stand.
As settlements, we're not people who really have been very diligent about fighting with people. We've kind of tried to create win-win all the time.
You pray to stay alive.
When you had nothing, when you have something, a lot of times you just kind of say, the expression is kiam. You know, it is what it is, but it isn't.
You better run, run, run when the devil calls your name.
That anymore. It can't be that. We have our future generations to look after.
Next week on APTN Investigates.
Dakota history in Canada is new for some people. My grandparents, my relatives' grandparents, they were landowners and they purchased their own land. In 1893, they were landowners and then the governments didn't know how to address them because they're on their own land.
On one hand, you know, Canada wants to reconcile, but how do you reconcile when you don't acknowledge the truth of what these Indian reserves are? They're not nations. When it comes to negotiating, we're not taking the approach that the Indians do.